Frida, Levi, and others who participate. Appreciate it. This morning we're looking at a passage from Psalm 81, and our psalm begins with the joyful shout of the congregation to God our strength, the God of Jacob, that is, the God of the whole of Israel. Sometimes they use Jacob and Israel interchangeably. The psalm continues as a festive and jubilant occasion of worship and celebration. But then at the end of verse 5, the psalmist confesses, I hear a speech I did not prepare. In other words, I'm about to tell you not words of my own, but a word from the living God. He then briefly recites the Hebrew people's history of how God has saved them. He reminds them of their covenant, obligation, and promise of faithfulness. And then he describes their present situation. The people had not paid attention to God's voice. They had not been obedient. And so now God had given them over to their own obstinance, their own proud, stubborn hearts. You know, we often think of the judgment of God as being lightning coming down, yet some catastrophe occurring like that. But what God's pattern seems to appear to be, at least throughout the Scripture, and I believe as well in our own history, is that God says finally, okay, have it your way. Have it your way. See what happens. So he had given them over to their proud, stubborn hearts, and this was the worst fate to which God could commit them. So now they were left to their own counsel. They could be told nothing, so the Lord left them to their own vast wisdom. The psalmist leaves them with a word of hope. He says, if you will but listen and walk in God's ways, then in no time God would subdue your enemies and turn against those who oppress you, and God would meet your physical needs with God's very best. But their problem was all too clear. They no longer had any desire for God. Proudly and still stubbornly chosen to go their own path was their path. It is the eternal problem that has been with humanity from the very beginning, from Adam and Eve. The refusal to trust God and to choose to depend upon themselves was the result of their pride, which separated them from the Creator who loved them. And even in the end, their pride caused them to be separated from each other. You remember the story of Adam and Eve and their shame in the garden as they tried to essentially not trust God, but said, oh, maybe we need to listen to the serpent. Maybe we need to pay attention to the fact that maybe God is holding back on us. And then in the end, that division that occurs where they suddenly feel now ashamed before God and they're hiding and such. And then the curse that falls upon them is kind of a natural consequence, which is that when sin enters into a broken relationship with us and our God, it also affects one another. Between the man and the woman, between all people. It becomes part of the consequences of our choosing. We continue with this problem today. Most of the conflicts and struggles we have in our relationships, both with God and with one another, are shot through and through with the problem of pride. That we know best, that we know better, that we will not humble ourselves to listen to another, to consider their advice, to consider their perspective. We're quick to recognize the problem of pride in others. We can see clearly that person's got a pride problem. But can I look in the mirror? Can I see my own pride problem? We are terribly effective at self-deception. There used to be a Peanuts cartoon where Linus one day says, he's talking things over with Charlie Brown, and he explains to him, when I get big, I'm going to be a humble little country doctor. I'll live in the city and see every morning I'll get up and I'll climb into my sports car and I'll zoom into the country, and then I'll start healing people. I'll heal everybody for miles around. And then the last frame, he winds up saying, I'll be a world famous, humble little country doctor. So we all think, even in our attempts to be humble, that we begin in reality to kind of lift ourselves up. We're in a culture that lifts up the self. Look at some of the most popular shows on television. Most are talent shows. And the driving force behind the people who often participate to become famous are involved in those. Samuel Johnson said, and listen to these words, fame is the vain attempt to fill the minds of others with yourself. I'm going to tell you that one again. Fame is the vain attempt to fill the minds of others with yourself. No wonder relationships and marriages have such difficulty in Hollywood among the famous, as well as with us. How in the world do we develop healthy, giving relationships when you swim in a culture that constantly tells you that it's all about you? And what do we take? What are they called? Selfies. But it's not simply a problem on the secular world level. There are constant warnings to the religious who imagine themselves with some form of righteousness. Our own sense of righteousness apparently gets in the way of true spirituality. Better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Proverbs 16. With the lowly is wisdom. Proverbs 11. All the prophets condemn pride and affirm humility. For example, Isaiah 57. I dwell in the high and holy place with him also that is of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of those who have contrite hearts. When I make myself humble, says 118th Psalm, I am promoted. And then along comes Jesus, and like children, Jesus says the darndest things. And at first we think his words are cute, his parables are so charming, until they start to become inappropriate and disrupt our carefully arranged lives. Here's an example. Verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. John 18. Now, why did Jesus depict humility in the form of a little child? Why not an ascetic, a recluse, or a pious priest? Jesus distills humility down to a single snapshot of a child sitting on his lap with no agenda except the pure fun of being there. The picture has nothing to do with the child's relationship with Jesus. It certainly has nothing to do with the child's performance or behavior. In a few minutes, the kid is going to hop down from his lap and go play with his friends. But the picture of humility will still be valid. The child accepts his lap as a gift, as care that comes to him freely. We call it grace. As we become adults, we begin to grow up. We begin to structure joy out of our lives in pursuit of our self-determined goals. We move away from humility that trusts God in the moment towards an addiction to control. We acquire an increasing number of obligations and ambitions and agendas, and we increase our guilt and experience a burden of expectation. If we are religious, we add in our attempt to act like good Christians, but deep down we still yearn for that childlike abandon that is freedom from self. Like Jesus, that child is abandoned to the moment and dependent on a loving father or mother for all their needs. There is no pride in that. They just depend and know and go to that loved one. There is simply the deepest recognition of dependence and trust. We want to be like a little child, but there is no way back except through the cross. That's the only way we come to understand again that we are received by God's mercy and grace through God's action, even the painful action of the cross. Through repentance, through recognizing our falling down and turning to God and saying, this is who I am. God help me. Through the humbling experience of becoming childlike. Through the humbling experience of becoming born again. Because to become born again, you have to die. In the deepest sense. Die to what I want, die to my agenda, and trust that God is dependable and worthy, and that God's love will not cease from me. Without the humility of Mary, Jesus could never have been born. Without Christ's willingness to humble himself, there could be no redemption or means of forgiveness. He made himself of no reputation and took upon him the form of a servant and was made in the likeness of men, and being found in a fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death on the cross. Philippians 2. Jesus did not intend anyone to believe they were righteous. Authentic righteousness comes only through him. Jesus particularly condemned those who believe themselves righteous, like the scribes and the Pharisees. He called on his followers to renounce wealth, power, and violence. Jesus is not a nice guy who is easy to live with. No one wants him for a roommate. Pray for your enemies, and you will be considered unpatriotic. Give your enemy your cloak, and you'll be charged with treason. Jesus would be very unwelcome in the political debates of today, as he called us to stop fighting among ourselves and deciding which side we are on, and to remember that God is calling us to reconciliation, even with those whom we may oppose. For we all stand under God's grace. Jesus would be quick to point out in our debates over Islam that there is a deep sense of fear and self-righteousness in our response to Muslims. To stereotype an entire people based on a few is the very definition of prejudice. And of course, Islam has its version of the KKK, or the Christian Identity Group, or Proud Boys, or other white supremacy or hate groups. But they no more represent Islam than the KKK represents Christianity. Pride blinds us to our own failings, our own sins. And so often we end up projecting our own inner darkness onto others. We forget that. I remember during serving at a church in Maryland that I would sometimes drive through Washington, D.C., and seeing, much to my surprise, a little church, while I was trying to find my way, and I want to admit and confess that I got lost many a time in Washington, D.C., but I managed to finally get back out. But I would drive in, and I went by this one section in the town, and there was this little church, and in front of it was a huge bronze statue right in front of that church building. And this was not a statue of Jesus. This was a statue of the pastor of that church standing with an open Bible, finger in the air, obviously proclaiming the word. I could not help but laugh at the gall and the pride it would take to build a statue of yourself in front of your church. But pride is not always so obvious. Sometimes you and I are tempted to feel slighted when our work is not recognized, or when circumstances seem unfair and they're not hearing our side of the story, or when we become impatient with a coworker or a classmate or even a family member. Our pride rears its ugly head and we become offended. I may not have an 8-foot bronze statue of myself in front of Smith Mountain Lake, in front of your building, but how many people have I cut off? How many people do I avoid? How many people do I tear down in the eyes of others because they have hurt my pride? That's always a issue of self-examination for the follower of Jesus. The Jewish Talmud, their wisdom literature, says, "He who offers humility to God and man shall be rewarded with a reward as if he had offered all the sacrifices in the world." The way of Jesus has always been the low path, where we let go of our own agendas and our own control. The world system always considers this to be crazy. Prudence demands that we fight for control, plan out our life like a budget. But the source of a person's humility stems from recognizing deep in our bones that we are helpless in the shadow of God's omnipotence and in the reality of life. But you see, this sense of helplessness is not what people are rushing out to experience. We proudly keep reaching out to control that which, in the end, we have no control over. I may not build an 8-foot bronze statue of myself to declare my own glory as a leader, but sometimes I refuse to bend my agenda to accommodate the needs of others I judge to be of less importance. And then I become judged by God for that. For that is not the heart and spirit of Jesus. It is the everyday self-elevation that individual Christians perpetrate as we interact with each other that grieves the Holy Spirit. Only with a humble heart can God begin to change a nation or an individual. It is the putting aside of our pride that the real miracles of God begin to occur. Though I may or may not have shared the story of Lee Whiston with you before, it's worth sharing again if I have. Lee Whiston says, years ago, my 12-year-old son had been stealing and lying. I had severely punished him from time to time, and one day I discovered that he had forged my name to a letter requesting the teacher to excuse 2 days' absence, which really had been truancy. I was angry. And I told him to go downstairs and take down his pants, and I was going to whip him. I followed and I walked over towards it. And then suddenly something in me broke. Stumbling, I said, "This isn't right. By whipping you like this, I feel like a brute. Somewhere I have failed you. I've not been the kind of father I ought to be." The tears began to stream down Lee Whiston's face, and he turned and left before his son could see his tears, and nothing more was said of the incident. And 45 years later, this son was giving a talk before some ministers and told of that incident, adding that was the day that he felt he began to understand and love his father. Lee said, "I had never known that. This experience had opened a whole new relationship between us until he told me of it a year or so ago. When I insisted on being in the firm command, demanding obedience, and standing on the pedestal of parental authority, there was a gap between us. I had gained respect but little love. Try as I would, I had never broken through his reserve. When my confession and shame came, I became broken. And then the Spirit of God broke through with power and, unbeknownst to me, started forging the band of love that has been constantly growing stronger to this day. Who knows what God may choose to do if we humble ourselves, allow ourselves to be broken, and put away our pride. The first step to acquiring humility is to recognize just how proud you and I really are and how that is affecting all of our relationships with both God and others. If you get in any kind of touch with God, you will be humbled. And this is where you begin to feel the infinite relief of having for once gotten rid of the pretensions that have made you restless and unhappy all your life. You will be able to let go of your pride and crawl up into the lap of Jesus and find peace.